Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. It took an American being killed by Britain in the midst of the Syrian desert for the danger of violent extremism to really hit home. But why does the West only seem to care about religious radicalism when it compromises its own security? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Hanif Kadir, a co-founder of the UK-based anti-extremist group Active Change Foundation. Mr. Kadir, thank you very much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, when extremism prevention is discussed in the British media, it's usually in the context of young British Muslims traveling to Syria, getting radicalized there, and then becoming a security risk once they decide to come back home. And that strikes me as a bit selfish, because if they were just to stay in Syria and fight an unfriendly government of, let's say, Bashar al-Assad, then radicalization is not really a problem. I mean, in fact, the more radicalized they are, the more likely they are to achieve this regime change goal. And it's only when they want to come home that the British government sees it as problematic. Doesn't this approach strike you as a bit self-centered?
It's a good question, but it's a very complex and difficult one to answer in that sense. I can fully appreciate the fact that when we got young Muslims traveling abroad for humanitarian purposes and helping out to alleviate the suffering of innocent women and children. But another thing is getting involved in a jihad, which is, okay, fair enough. They want to go and help, remove Assad or help the Syrian Free Army or the rebels. But through that process, there's a fear. And we've seen through experience over the last year or 2 years that young men, I mean, look at this one man that has now joined the ISIS group and has carried out a barbaric act of evil by beheading a reporter. So these are the fears that, whilst I understand from a community perspective that young men and women are being drawn into that, wanting to go and help alleviate the suffering, there's the ultimate fear of that creating a huge sense of vulnerability for them, being indoctrinated and radicalized to an extent where taking off somebody's head becomes the norm.
That was exactly my point, that, the UK government only sees a problem with that when an American is being killed. But, those same, jihadi converts, they have been cutting off the heads of Syrian citizens for 3 years now. And the British government, the American government, never saw a problem with that. In fact, it was described as an act of, helping the Syrians to bring about their democracy.
I think this is a sense of bringing the truth home. When the truth hits home, it's a daunting fact. And that's exactly my point, is that when we've got young men and women from this part of the world, from what one would say is a civilized part of the world, however, many people would differ with my opinion on that. Now, when we've got young men and women going across and carrying out the same kind of atrocities as others have been doing, and then, potentially coming back to this country with that kind of a mindset, with that kind of a, lack of appreciation for human life, that is a concern, not just for the government, I would say it's a concern for the Muslim community and others around.
Mm-hmm. Now, this idea that you can somehow tame extremism or channel extremism to make it work in your interest is not really new. I mean, we see it play out in Afghanistan with the support for the Mujahideen, who later become Al-Qaeda. I think we see it also to some extent being used in Libya and then later on Syria, which produced this threat of ISIS. And, I don't want to blame the existence and strengthening of ISIS exclusively on Western policies, because it's extremely complicated issue. But I would like to ask you, to what extent do you think the American and British policies in the Middle East have contributed to the creation of this indeed very terrifying terrorist group?
That's a good point, and it's I think the Western governments have fully understood that their policies have contributed significantly to the radicalization of young men and women around the world. This is without a shadow of a doubt. I will confirm with that. I would agree with that some of the young men that we work with certainly have been radicalized because of Western foreign policy. However, there are a number of theories that they apply and adopt which are not always true. Significant issues with regards to conspiracy theories, that this is a war on Islam, etc., etc. But certainly I would agree that Western foreign policy has made and contributed to the radicalization of thousands of many young men and women.
Mr. Qadir, you just mentioned the young British Muslims that you work with, and I think when we talk about the threat of ISIS, we need to consider that there are two very different groups of people fighting for it. One group, and this is, I think, a minority, are those foreign-born jihadis that have been converted by those theorists that you mentioned. But the bulk of ISIS are Iraqis or Arabs, locals who have been converted not so much by the theories but by horrific realities of their daily existence. I mean, those are Iraqi males in their 20s and their 30s who came of age during the first and second invasion of their country. And I would like to ask you, in what way do you think these two groups are different in terms of their conviction, in terms of the ferocity that they show on the battlefield, and ultimately in terms of the techniques that could be used to bring them back into normal life?
From history, in Muslims, in Islam, from history we've learned, and we've got quotations and books to tell us that extremism will continue to rise from amongst the Muslims, and we need to remove them as much as, and over time they have risen and they have gone away. This group has now, well, these groups have now took that rise to another level. They have now come forward with a very, very barbaric and extreme version and interpretation of what they believe is, Islam and Sharia. Totally wrong. I mean, but what they have done, they have worked on what the hearts and minds, now this is very important to understand, that these groups have understood and worked upon the hearts and minds of individuals across the world who see and perceive that Western foreign powers are targeting Muslims, but also that Muslim leaders, from around the world are failing to respond and react to the problems that they are facing. So they feel that they have to now rise up and build a momentum. So what they have done, they have attracted young men and women from across the globe to this new idea that they will now take forward, and they will remove those leaders that are in the Muslim communities that are not reacting and doing things what they should be doing.
Well, Mr. Qadir, I agree with you. You just used the word barbaric, and there are a number of very strong words that Western media, and in fact media all over the world, are using to describe them. They've been described as sadists and what have you. I mean, they've been described as beasts, as non-humans. But shouldn't we also be asking what made them so cruel? Because we can all pretend that they are just a bunch of psychopaths, but the bunch is so large that that would be statistically improbable. Something made those people so heartless.
One thing I have to explain, and this is very important to understand, is that firstly, Islam does not allow this. The text within Islam do not allow this. The teachings of Islam do not allow this. However, we've been warned about these groups and how evil they will look. The texts ascribe these to be the sons of the devils, dogs of hellfire, for the main reason because they are so vile and so barbaric. That's why they are ascribed to be like the dogs of hellfire. Now, the way that they come across, so romantic in their approach, attracting many impressionable young men who want to do something or are very angry. Don't forget, they are working on the hearts and minds of young men and women who are very, very emotional, but also equally very, very angry.
But Mr. Qadir, don't those people have a reason to be angry? And I'm not talking about Islam here. I'm talking about, again, the realities of their life, because I assume that those people, even the the most hardline of the jihadists, I assume that they probably didn't have the easiest of lives. I think that this is, it was, again, perhaps a war that was waged in their own country that made them this way. Shouldn't we all account for that?
When I say angry, I mean, don't forget, there's lots of perceptions out there in amongst the social media, the perceptions that our young men and women have about the West's attack on Islam, it being a crusade, that they need to wipe Islam off the face of the earth, what's going on in Gaza and in Israel, ongoing issues around that. The young men and women that I'm talking about are very angry because they feel that the Muslim leaders have let them down. This is their perception. They feel the Muslim leaders are working with Western governments, for the sake of oil and revenues, etc., etc. Their anger is going on beyond control. Now, that doesn't mean that they are not human beings or they can't be changed. I, for one, will say that anything can change within a young person with the right kind of support. However, when they get to a point where taking off somebody's head and without battering an eyelid, that's where I think that now we have to go back to our theological guidance where we are instructed Islamically. Now, I can't say this and I can't promote this, but I will just quote you one verse which says that if they rise from amongst you, and should you be able to approach them, then attack them and kill them wherever you find them, for they will continue to rise and be a cancer. Now, this is a text that we are warned about these kind of individuals, and we need to remove them.
But Mr. Qadir, isn't that also very convenient for the Western sort of approach to these issues? Because we all know that violence begets violence. And if we again assume this very militaristic, very violent approach to them, to ISIS, then perhaps that's going to, produce a whole new generation of jihadists. Because this, again, my point, I come back to the same point, is that many of them were radicalized not by the texts. I assume that during the First and Second Iraq War, people didn't have time to really study holy books. I think they were radicalized by the killings and by the hunger, by the radicalism of war that they saw all around them.
Absolutely, and I for 1 minute don't disagree with you. This is another thing that is driving. These are many people talk about young men and women having a sense of belonging because they want to be part of a network. Nonsense. It's what's been happening over time, over a period. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Somalia, in Palestine and Gaza. Young men and women are being, pushed to a point where they feel that there's nothing else that can be done except committing acts of violence against what they feel is the enemy or the perpetrator. Look, they've been indoctrinated over time. They've been watching images, and today we see that what happens an hour ago in Iraq, within 20 minutes, the whole world knows about it. So our young men and women are exposed to that kind of indoctrination and are being radicalized as a result. So, for sure, foreign policy, double standards certainly plays a part.
Mr. Qadir, if we look at the latest research on violence, it's essentially, this old combination of nature versus nurture. And sure, some people are more prone to violence than others, but I think it's, many scientists agree that it's primarily the environment or early trauma during the formative childhood years that turns people into heartless, cruel individuals. And if we look at what is happening in the Middle East, if we look at what is happening in North Africa, the social and economic environment seems to be getting from bad to worse. And, there is a whole new generation of kids who have been exposed to terrific things. I wonder if that makes you hopeless in your efforts to combat this violent extremism, because it seems that the pool of potential jihadists is now wider than ever before.
It is a challenge, and I agree that certainly this poses a huge challenge to us. When we look at a young man or a young female who's lost their parents or their whole family, an example would be, let's say in Gaza, who's, let's say the entire family consisting of 25 people has been blown to pieces by a bomb or a stray bomb, let's say. They're not going to listen to reason. They're not going to look at, Islamic texts and, and theological guidance on how to manage this. They want revenge. And we see young men and women who look at that and take it personally. However, it's not going to stop our efforts to change young men and women. It's a challenge indeed, but when we talk about young men and women in this country who feel very emotional and take it very personal, we then, this is where I would disagree with everybody who says it's a theological problem. I would say the answer to the problem is a theological approach. So this is where theology comes into play. That are you allowed to seek revenge because of this? Is it, there's all kinds of things that we can use and apply, and we do. And sometimes, it takes longer, and sometimes it's forever ongoing. And sometimes we have to accept that we will fail.
Mr. Qadir, we have to take a very short break here, but when we come back, the UK is about to introduce a set of measures to combat religious extremism, but is it enough? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing Islamic extremism with Hanif Kadir, a co-founder of the Active Change Foundation. Now, Mr. Kadir, when you speak about religious extremism, you obviously speak from your own experience as somebody who, back in 2002, went to Afghanistan to fight on the side of the Taliban against, I assume, the American forces. What made you change your mind?
Look, this is a whole wealth of experience has been won by me by going over there and coming back and you know, being involved and working with individuals that, you know, have had the idea of going there. What worked for me, what helped me, and I think it's a blessing that I was sent from God, is that going there and looking at the hypocrisy, looking at the double standards, and looking at the atrocities committed by, you know, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. You know, when we talk about innocent women and children being killed by Western powers, we also got to look. Example would be ISIS. They are killing thousands of innocent women and children. And this is exactly what happened to me when I was faced with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They had no regard for human life. This is one thing that my religion does not allow. And this is one thing that angered me even more. And luckily, I managed to come back. I am confident that young men and women that are going into Iraq or Syria, you know, when they're exposed to the lies and the hypocrisy, they want to come back. And sadly, at the moment, there is no way for them to come back because they may be locked up and put away. So there needs to be a strategy to allow those ones who have seen the light, let's say, you know, been exposed to the hypocrisy and lies and want out, we allow them a safe passage back.
Well, Mr. Kadir, I think this is a very interesting point that you mentioned, this disregard for human life. And I heard you say in one of the previous interviews that some young people, perhaps young men, young women, tend to romanticize conspiracy theories, and this is something that may draw them into war zones. And I think that was perhaps true for Al-Qaeda, whose PR message really focused on the suffering of innocent civilians, on the suffering of women and children. But the ISIS outreach program is very different. They do the killing themselves, and they're very open about it. I mean, they almost revel in their violence. Why do you think they're still attractive to, you know, young men like yourself? I mean, you said that this is something, this violence turned you, made you turn away from them. But it seems that, you know, there's also enough young men and women who are attracted by this very brutality.
Excellent point. And let me reply to that in this way. When I went to Afghanistan, there was no man that subscribed himself to be the Khalifa and him to run the Caliphate of Islam. The only one that was a local Amir, a local Caliph, was Mullah Omar. In this instance, we have Abu Bakr Baghdadi, who has now claimed to be the Khalifa of the Muslims. And the time he's chosen is Syria. Now we go back to theological quotes and theological guidance where we are told that there will be an army that will march with black banners, and amongst them will rise a leader. Now this is where our young men and women, you know, fail sadly, because they're not fully aware of what religion and what theology says about this. They believe that this person is the leader for the Muslims in this time. However, and they subscribe to it. They ascribe to whatever he has to offer. And be that killing or be that, you know, protecting women and children, they see that they have to ascribe to him whichever way it may be. Now, whatever he has to offer, they will subscribe to that as well. And sadly, that's where I will say this is where the failure, the systematic failure of theologians, imams in our country, up and down the country, are failing to refute the likes of Abu Bakr Baghdadi. Their silence is almost been explicit. Now, my argument is that we need to have the right kind of education and guidance for our young men and women. Otherwise, they will continue to be recruited and brainwashed by individuals like al-Baghdadi and Abu Bakr, who's in Boko Haram. These are deranged mental individuals who are using theology and texts to recruit their soldiers.
Well, Mr. Kadir, you just made a number of theological references, and that leads me to my next question, which is very, very sensitive. I understand that, but I would still like to ask it. You know, this disregard for human life, isn't it at least partially religious? Because if you believe in the afterlife, if you believe that death is not final, then it's easy for you to believe that you are maybe even helping your victim by, helping him or her escape this wicked world. I wonder if this mindset is at least partially responsible for the ease that these people have when killing and dying for their cause.
Absolutely, this is the whole thing. I mean, it may seem as if I'm being a bit contradicting on my statements, but when we talk about how young men and women are getting indoctrinated through theology, they have no understanding of their religion. If they did, they wouldn't even ascribe to people like Abu Bakr Baghdadi. We have many thousands and millions of people that refute them. However, the small minority that are accepting this, they believe indeed that by ascribing to them, by going out and killing non-Muslims, even other Muslims who disagree with them, that they are cleansing the earth and they are purifying a nation. Now, sadly, they are being told this by people, that ascribe to ISIS and their ideology. This is an ideology that has no grounding within Islam. However, they take context and they take it out of context and they present it eloquently in Arabic to many of our young men and women. And that's why, I'm saying again that theologians in this country and across the world, we have a handful of very, very, very renowned scholars who are refuting daily, the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. However, in our countries around Europe, there's not enough. There needs to be a louder voice from our mosques who have the eyes and the ears of our community. They need to stand up on a Friday on the pulpit and they need to challenge the ideology of ISIS.
Well, but Mr. Kadir, is it really fair to blame the community for not doing enough to combat this very violent ideology when your own government is very, I would say, soft and polite when it comes to Saudi Arabia, the country that has invested billions in promoting and spreading the Salafi and Wahhabi ideas all around the world?
Now you're getting into a very sort of very unique debate, and this can go on for ages. I disagree with that. I disagree with that. Look, Wahhabi and Salafi ideology is not an actual fact. The only ones that are refuting ISIS is coming from the Salafi scholars in Saudi Arabia and some of the Salafi scholars in this country. I don't ascribe myself to that, but what I am saying here is that let's not get things confused. People like Anjem Choudhury, Omar Bakri Mohammed, and people like Abu Bakr Baghdadi, they claim to be, the Wahhabist, Salafist, minded individuals. However, far from it. They are takfiri, khawarijites, ascribing to the evil ways of the devil. Now, this is where it's important to look. Our government in this country has done everything in its power to help our Muslim communities. And when you say that it's not fair to ascribe blame to the communities,
I apologize for intervening here, but we are all shocked by what happened to James Foley, by this execution, but this is something that Saudi Arabia does on a regular basis, decapitations. They're openly prosecuting other religious groups. So, it seems that the world is so very horrified by the ISIS, but they're very nonchalant about Saudi Arabia doing the same thing.
No, that's capital punishment. That's not going into war and taking off the head of another individual. That's punishment for a crime. We have the same capital punishment in America by lethal injection. In Saudi Arabia, it's about beheading. And I'm not going to say I agree with it or disagree with it. If somebody has committed an atrocious crime, then he deserves to be punished with whatever the punishment from that country deals with him. Now, with regards to beheading, that does not come from Islam. There are quotations and refutations about this, and many. I can call for a jihad tomorrow by giving example of theological quotes that date back centuries that say that stand up now and go and fight ISIS.
Well, Mr. Kadir, we're really running out of time, but I have to tell you that letting Saudi Arabia off the hook seems somewhat strange here, at least to me. But let me ask you the very, very final question. The British government, the Home Secretary Theresa May, has suggested a number of anti-terrorist measures, including, stripping some of the UK citizens of their passports in case they travel to Syria or Iraq, and a number of other measures that all strike me as extremely domestically oriented. It seems that what Britain is trying to do here is to keep those, jihadists and those radicalized individuals at bay outside its borders, rather than addressing the issue of violent jihadism at face value. Isn't this approach again a bit too self-serving?
some of the measures that are being put forward and are being suggested are very, 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 very intense and very, very draconian in their way. I think this is also like what you call a knee-jerk reaction, but I can understand, that if people are going to go over and commit atrocities abroad, and that stands for everybody and for every other community as well, not just Muslims. Now, if they're going to go out and sort of commit violent acts abroad, then I think that checks and balances need to be put in place. Now, stripping them of their nationality, stripping them of their passports, this may be an idea that's put forward. I don't think it's going to be realistically put in place. However, I welcome the fact that if somebody is coming back, I would welcome an intervention, some kind of assessment being made, and if somebody can be helped, I welcome that. I would put myself forward to help that individual. But I can understand that national security measures need to be taken seriously.
I understand that, and I think we all would agree with that. But can this problem of global jihadism or violent Islamic extremism be really addressed without some countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, first changing their approach to foreign policy and, changing, the ease that they have been showing in intervening in Muslim countries, because that seems to be the root of the problem, or at least one of the very effective mechanisms that those people are using in converting, people to their ranks.
I mean, point taken, I understand. Look, every country has its own foreign policy, its own interests, but consideration certainly needs to be made. Whenever America or the UK is going to go and, invest in something or contribute to a foreign policy initiative, then I think they need to consider the fact that, look, if we're going to go into Iraq, we need to consider what the implications are going to be on the Iraqi individuals, or Iraqi-originated individuals in our country. Likewise, if we was to go to war with India tomorrow, don't we think that the Indians in this country are going to respond and react? Everything needs to be done in consideration and in moderation. So certainly, consideration needs to be made, but also, I, as a British citizen, understand that I live in this country as a British citizen, and I understand that this country has its own interests and have its own policies. But I would hope that the Prime Minister would be considerate of my emotions and my values and my beliefs, as well as the national interests of this country.
Some of these policies seem to be a shot in the foot, because all of those countries that the United States, the United Kingdom have intervened so far, ostensibly for noble reasons, they now have the very, very astute problem of Islamic extremism. But unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We ran out of time. I really appreciate you being on the show. And to our viewers, please keep the conversation going on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.